The frog who never gave up. One bright morning, a large group of frogs began traveling through a thick green forest toward a beautiful pond far away. The frogs were happy and excited, jumping from rock to rock while singing funny songs. Some frogs competed to see who could jump the farthest, while others chased flies for breakfast. Among the group were two best friends named Tito and Kiko. Tito was careful and often worried about problems, but Kiko was cheerful and always believed that every difficult situation had a solution. As the frogs continued their journey, they entered a darker part of the forest filled with tall trees and slippery mud. A fat frog named Bobo suddenly slipped on a banana peel and rolled into a bush. Everyone burst into laughter. Bobo stood up angrily and shouted, "Who throws banana peels in the forest?" A monkey sitting on a tree raised his hand proudly and said, "Breakfast accident." Even Bobo started laughing after seeing the monkey's silly face. The frogs continued walking deeper into the woods while strange sounds echoed around them. One tiny frog whispered nervously, "Maybe ghosts live here." Another frog replied, "Ghosts don't eat frogs, so stop shaking." Tito looked around carefully while Kiko happily hummed songs. Suddenly, Tito stepped on loose mud and slipped badly. Kiko tried grabbing him, but both frogs lost balance and fell into a deep dark pit hidden beneath leaves. The two frogs screamed loudly while falling through the darkness. Above them, the other frogs rushed toward the hole and looked down with fear. The pit was extremely deep, and its muddy walls were slippery. One old frog shook his head sadly and said, "No frog has ever escaped from such a pit." Another frog added, "They are as good as dead." The crowd slowly became silent with sadness. At the bottom of the pit, Tito and Kiko slowly stood up covered in mud. Tito looked terrified, but Kiko smiled and said, "Relax, my friend. We just need to jump out." Both frogs bent their legs and jumped with all their strength. They almost reached halfway before sliding down the muddy wall again. Dirt splashed everywhere, and Kiko accidentally landed face first in the mud. The frogs above the pit began shouting loudly. "Stop trying," yelled one frog. "You'll never escape," shouted another. Tito looked upward nervously as the negative voices echoed inside his mind. Kiko cleaned mud from his eyes and laughed. "They must be cheering for us," he said happily. Tito looked confused but decided to keep trying. The two frogs jumped again and again, but every attempt failed. Their legs became tired, and their breathing grew heavy. Meanwhile, the frogs above had already started discussing funeral plans. One frog suggested decorating the pond with flowers, while another asked if mosquito soup would be served. "You think about food all the time," another frog complained. Tito slowly began losing confidence. Every negative word from above felt heavier than the mud around him. "Maybe they are right," he whispered sadly. Kiko quickly shook his head and replied, "Impossible is just a scary word. We can still do this." Tito tried another jump but failed once again. A squirrel passing nearby stopped after hearing the noise. "What happened?" he asked. "Two frogs are trapped," answered the crowd. The squirrel looked into the pit and shouted, "You can do it. Don't give up." But the loud negative crowd drowned out his voice, and Tito only heard discouragement. After many failed attempts, Tito sat down weakly. "I can't continue," he said quietly. Kiko encouraged him to try one more time, but Tito shook his head sadly. The crowd above nodded as if their predictions had come true. Tito slowly closed his eyes and completely gave up hope. Kiko felt heartbroken seeing his best friend stop trying. For a moment, even he felt weak and scared. The crowd continued shouting, "Stop jumping. You're only hurting yourself." But instead of giving up, Kiko strangely became more energetic. He waved at the frogs above with a huge smile. The crowd looked confused. "Why is he smiling?" one frog asked. Another frog joked, "I think the mud damaged his brain." Kiko jumped again and reached slightly higher than before. He smiled proudly and shouted, "Thank you for believing in me." The frogs stared at him in shock. One frog yelled, "We are not encouraging you." But Kiko barely heard him. Years earlier, Kiko had attended a jungle music concert where a drummer bird played extremely loud drums for 3 straight days. Since then, Kiko's hearing had become very weak. Because Kiko could not hear clearly, he misunderstood the crowd completely. He believed everyone above was cheering him on and giving him strength. "Your support is amazing," he shouted happily. The crowd became silent with embarrassment. A young frog whispered softly, "Maybe we should actually encourage him instead of discouraging him." Slowly, a few frogs started cheering sincerely. "Come on, Kiko," they shouted. "You can escape." Even the old frog who had lost hope earlier joined the encouragement. The energy around the pit slowly changed. Kiko jumped again with all his strength and reached higher than before. The crowd became excited. But suddenly, Kiko slipped and crashed into the mud again. A worm stuck to his nose, and Kiko laughed loudly before eating it like a snack. Everyone burst into laughter. Dark clouds suddenly filled the sky, and heavy rain started pouring into the forest. Water slowly began rising inside the pit. Some frogs panicked and worried that Kiko might drown. But Kiko remained calm and watched the rising water carefully. Then Kiko had an idea. As the water level rose, he used it to jump from a higher position. This time he came very close to escaping. The crowd screamed with excitement and encouragement. A clever rabbit nearby tied a vine to a tree branch and lowered it into the pit. "Grab this," he shouted. Kiko jumped toward the vine but missed and crashed backward. The rabbit accidentally slipped into a puddle, leaving only his long ears sticking out. The entire forest laughed again. Kiko stood up slowly and looked toward the sky. He remembered every difficult moment of his life when others doubted him because of his weak hearing. He remembered being laughed at during school races and jungle games. But he also remembered every time he kept trying until he succeeded. "I'm not finished yet," Kiko whispered firmly. The crowd became silent and watched carefully. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Kiko bent his legs one final time and jumped with all his strength. He flew higher and higher toward the edge of the pit. The frogs held their breath nervously. Kiko stretched his hands and grabbed the edge, but the muddy ground began breaking apart. "No!" shouted the crowd in fear. Just before Kiko slipped back down, the rabbit pushed the vine closer. Kiko grabbed it tightly while the frogs above pulled together with all their strength. "Pull harder!" shouted Bobo while slipping on another banana peel. Even the monkey joined the rescue while still eating bananas. Slowly, Kiko climbed upward until he finally escaped the pit. The entire forest exploded with cheers and celebration. Kiko lay on the ground breathing heavily before suddenly standing up and bowing dramatically. "Thank you all for your wonderful cheering," he announced proudly. The frogs looked at each other awkwardly. One frog nervously asked, "You really thought we were encouraging you the whole time?" Kiko smiled and nodded happily. "Of course, your loud voices gave me power to keep jumping." The crowd felt ashamed after hearing his words. The old frog slowly stepped forward.